Hello, my name is Mai P.
And my name is Elizabeth Castillo. We are both assistant professors in the Faculty of Leadership and Interdisciplinary Studies in the College of Integrative Sciences and Arts at Arizona State University. Today, we're going to be sharing a project we've been working on with support from the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics. It's integrating Eastern and Western perspectives on virtue ethics. In this video, we introduce a new way to think about ethics. We'll show how the Eastern and Western perspectives of virtue ethics can be integrated using complexity theory. Then we'll share some practical suggestions for what you can do to promote and reflect on virtue ethics in your own life.
So first of all, let's define what virtue ethics is. Virtue ethics focuses on goodness as a fundamental attribute of human beings. It sees virtuous behavior as varying with and dependent upon one's social identity. Unlike other approaches, virtue ethics asks us to consider not just the action, but also the agent, himself or herself. It focuses on what sort of person we are, rather than what sorts of action we should perform. Actions, where they are considered, are in the light of who we are as persons, rather than detached from the human character. The adaptive flexibility that arises from this holistic view of the ethical agent has given virtue ethics substantial traction among business ethicists, professionals, as a decision-making framework to apply in various business settings.
You may be wondering, why is this topic important? Over 200 years ago, Adam Smith observed that capitalism can only be successful to the degree its participants behave morally. That's because trust is the glue that keeps markets intact, making economic exchange possible. Today, we live in an increasingly globalized and fast-paced world. Technology has also dramatically increased the speed and complexity of economic exchange. As you'll see, virtue ethics offers a framework to guide individual and organizational behavior in ways that promote the sustainability of commerce. These definitions exemplifying the meaning of virtues in the Western tradition of Aristotle. 2,300 years ago, he described virtue as the various ways in which a person's non-rational elements cooperate with reason so that human beings fulfill their function well and in accordance with complete virtue. The Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics includes three components. The first is excellence or virtue. The second is practical wisdom gained from experience. And the third is flourishing. Perfect virtue is seldom achieved because it's hard to align our emotion with our rationality. Aristotle therefore described virtue as occurring along a continuum. Over the past 2,000 years, Western scholars continued this line of thinking, consistently viewing virtue as a character trait. At its best, virtue is deeply ingrained, multidimensional aspect of a person that manifests in our thoughts, words, and deeds in every circumstance. Another aspect of the Western perspective is that character must be developed. Western scholars tend to describe virtue development as a linear progression, where people transition through stages. An example is Kohlberg's 3 stages of moral development. In the first stage, it's pre-conventional morality, where what is deemed right is based on what satisfies a person's own wants or needs. The second level is conventional morality, where behavior is considered moral as it conforms to social expectations, pleasing others, and obeying laws and authority. The third level is post-conventional, where a person discerns for themselves the values that make for a good society by empathizing with multiple perspectives. Kohlberg saw the progression through these stages as always upward. A person cannot go back to a prior level. However, not all people reach post-conventional morality. Western scholars generally agree that once a certain virtue is learned or developed, it is settled, stable, and thus a static thing that people possess.
Now, while virtue in the Aristotelian sense is specific to each individual, Eastern thinkers define virtue as something social and dynamic. We now highlight the concepts of virtue and virtue ethics in early Confucianism and Daoism. We take the stance that early Chinese moral philosophers are virtue ethicists, in the sense that they are mainly concerned with describing the self-cultivation process of how a person becomes virtuous, instead of prescribing what is good and what is right. In classical Confucianism, the self is conceptualized as the center of a network of relationship, and never an entity that can be isolated. Hence, acquiring virtue through self-cultivation is a never-ending social process to fully realize one's capacity as a human being. Virtues are essential, yet inevitable parts of the self-cultivation process. It can be acquired as easily as being willing to practice it. It is because virtue is inherently tied to the goodness of human nature that the golden rule in Confucianism is intentionally formulated in the negative form. What you do not want others to do to you, do not do to others. If humans are good by nature, and virtuous is something easily expressed, then they do not need positive, concrete moral rules that provide guidance about how to act in order to be virtuous. Expressing one's nature is the highest transcendence within its own reality and requires no external help. In short, from a classical Confucian perspective, the study of virtue ethics is actually a study of the human person, as they cultivate their inborn good nature to fully realize and holistically embrace their humanity. Early Daoists referred to virtue as De, or the many ways that the ineffable Tao is manifested in the world. Because the Tao is present everywhere, everything, and every being inherently reflect the Tao in their natural state and form. Consequently, virtue, or manifestations of the Tao, is also natural and intrinsic to each being, though the way in which each being shows its virtue is diverse and different. Zhuangzi's Ethics of Differences asserts that we must respect others' natural tendencies and not impose our own intention or tendency onto others. Instead, we must take into account the specific situations that others are in. This is a strong restriction to the positive form of the Golden Rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, because what is right to you may not be right to others. Zhuangzi made this clear in multiple stories. One such example is the Marquis of Lu's treatment of the seabird. He escorted the seabird to the ancestral temple, where he entertained it, performing the 9 shao music for it to listen to, and presenting it with the meat of oxen, pigs, and sheep sacrifice to feast on. But the bird only looked dazed and forlorn, refusing to eat a single slice of meat or drink a cup of wine, and in 3 days it was dead. Here, the Marquis was wrong because he treated the seabird in the way that he would like to be treated, not the way that the seabird would like to be treated. The right thing to do would have been to let the seabird live in its natural environment, to meet its natural needs, and to use it in accordance with its abilities. Having talked about the two traditions, we now draw onto the Eastern and Western perspectives to develop an integrative framework of virtue ethics. As you can see, there are a number of differences between the Eastern and the Western expression of virtue ethics. In the West, virtue is seen more as a static object, whereas Eastern views see it as a dynamic process. Western philosophers think that virtue has to be taught or acquired through learning and maintained by individual effort. On the contrary, Eastern philosophers believe that virtue is innate, but can be further realized by internal reflection as well as by social relationships.
Despite these differences, Eastern and Western perspectives also share some commonalities. These include seeing virtue as an essential element that is needed for people and society to thrive. Also, both Eastern and Western traditions describe virtue as being inherently generative. That is, it creates enabling conditions that make well-being possible. That's because virtues such as goodness, excellence, caring, and benevolence build capacity in both the giver and the receiver, increasing options. As noted earlier, Adam Smith emphasized that moral behavior is essential to align and promote the welfare of individuals and society, thereby making capitalism a viable economic system. Additionally, both Eastern and Western perspectives see virtue as iterative in that it develops over time, and both viewpoints agree that virtue must be practiced.
So integration of both the Eastern and the Western perspectives of virtue ethics lead us to development of a new definition of virtue. We begin with goodness as a core tenet of virtue. We propose a formal definition of virtue as a moral agent's propensity to perform goodness, with goodness defined as what is sustainable and generative to both the individual agent and the system. In a small system, such as a relationship between two people, goodness means what is beneficial for both people. In the larger system, such as a country, goodness means what is good for both the agent performing the action and the country. Because what constitutes goodness varies based on situations, how virtue is expressed also varies, giving rise to a variety of manifestations that are commonly referred to as virtues, such as courage, benevolence, justice, or wisdom. In this analogy, virtue is like white light, with a context as a prism. White light, when shown through a prism, will exhibit different colors. The same virtuous person, in different situations, will express behaviors that can be interpreted as different virtues.
We developed our conceptual framework of virtue ethics using the lens of complex adaptive systems. Complexity is the generation of collective, dynamical behavior from simple interactions between large numbers of subunits over time. In complex systems, the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. In our model, this happens when individual people interact in virtuous ways. These interactions generate emergence, a qualitative shift at the macro level. Here, the emergent property is collective flourishing, which then creates enabling conditions that foster the well-being of individuals. Over time, this repeated interplay becomes a virtuous cycle. Emergence is a particularly important process in complex systems because it gives rise to co-evolution, the mutual influence and development that arise through interactions between the system, its members, and the operating environment. Scholars describe coevolution as being fundamental to organizational value creation and sustainability. The Confucian negative formulation of the Golden Rule serves as a boundary condition, providing behavioral limits that prevent inadvertent damage to others. In complex systems, the states towards which a system tends to gravitate are called attractors. In our model, we conceptualize virtue ethics as an algorithm. That is, a behavioral rule that develops virtue as a system's stable attractor. Because people are connected in many ways, what one person does affects others. If a person pursues a goal of flourishing, others will also benefit through a ripple effect. Similarly, if someone harms another, that harm eventually will return back to the generator through their interconnectedness. Using ethics as an algorithm therefore promotes stability and sustainability under dynamic conditions. This creates a feedback process where individuals' outputs of virtuous behavior become new inputs that create emergent property of collective flourishing. This heuristic also provides freedom for the system to self-organize in a way that keeps it in sync with its context over long-term time horizons, thereby benefiting future generations. So what does this mean for organizations? As the scholar Heinz von Forster stated, as managers, we have to learn to be what we really are, not doers and commanders, but catalysts and cultivators of a self-organizing system in an evolving context. Using virtue ethics as a heuristic to guide organizations enables leaders to make this shift. First, leaders need to make virtue ethics a fundamental part of their organizational culture. Managers should incorporate ethics into business processes and operations, including job descriptions, performance reviews, and professional development. Leaders should also make ethics a tangible part of organizational culture by using tools such as stories, case studies, icons, videos, and social media to co-create with employees a narrative that internally and externally expresses their organization's virtuous identity. Leaders can also develop experiential learning opportunities like action research and appreciative inquiry. These collaborative learning while doing processes identify and solve practical problems facing the organization. Finally, leaders can adopt corporate reporting activities like integrative reporting to shine a light on the fundamental role that ethics play in value creation and sustainability.
So far in this talk, we have offered a new way to think about virtue ethics by integrating both the Eastern and Western perspective on virtue ethics and connecting to the complexity theory. We have also offered several suggestions for practice that are easy to implement. We would like to conclude with a few ideas for your further reflection and discussion. Now, if you think of your social networks, those that you belong to, such as family, workplace, or friends, how do you express virtue? How do you maintain harmony with others when they may or may not be the same as you? What effects have you seen when virtue is or is not practiced? And how can you make ethics more visible in your network, organization, or community? Thank you for watching this video. We hope that you've learned something through this lecture, and please feel free to contact us if you have any questions.